Late in the 2009 college football season, the Florida Gators were at the peak of college football. 2 national titles in the last 3 seasons, the best coach in all of college football in Urban Meyer, and a program that recruited at an elite level every season. Just 15 years later and 5 head coaches later, the Gators are a far cry from where they were at their peak. So what happened to the Florida Gators football program? Well, in order to understand that, we have to go back to Florida football post Steve Spurrier. Spurrier was the longtime legendary head coach for the Florida Gators, and after him, Florida fell ungracefully under Ron Zook, a couple underwhelming seasons in a row, and he was out after 3 seasons. Florida turned to Urban Meyer. Meyer was great at Utah and Bowling Green, but many thought he didn't have the experience or skills necessary to win in the South. The doubters were very loud, but Meyer comes in, and year 1 was okay. They went 9-3 and won the Outback Bowl. This did little to dispel the doubters that he had about his fit and his fit with the culture in the South. But it was the class of 2006 that changed everything. This class in 2006 was the first dose of just how powerful Urban Meyer would be as a recruiter at the Florida Gators. They had the 15th ranked class in 2005, but this first full class rose up to number 2 in the entire country. It was an elite class stacked with all the key pieces that would dictate the future of Florida football. Tim Tebow, Percy Harvin, Brandon Spikes, Carlos Dunlap, Aaron Hernandez, Jermaine Cunningham, Riley Cooper, and so many more not only made an impact on the Gators, but eventually went on to make an impact in the NFL. These key pieces were one of the reasons that the Gators launched themselves into the glory days. Florida became a problem. Over the next 4 seasons, the Gators went 49-7, including 2 national titles, 3 top 3 finishes, and a Rose Bowl victory. The Gators were on top of the college football world, and they were on top of the sports world. Tebow time, the promise, iconic players, iconic plays, all these images stemmed from Florida football. They were seemingly unstoppable. And even after a season in 2009 where they didn't win a national title, it really felt like the national title ran through Gainesville. The Florida Gators' sudden ascension under Urban Meyer somehow pales in comparison to how quickly the fall-off occurred. After a dreamlike ride, 2010 was not smooth sailing. Florida started 2-3 in conference and was turning in a mediocre season, and Meyer had struggled with ongoing health issues that almost resulted in him not coaching in the 2010 season at all. Details came out about how he faced health issues late in the 2009 season as well, and he finally announced he would retire from coaching due to these health concerns and coached his final game in a win in the Outback Bowl at the end of a disappointing season. And just like that, the Urban Meyer era was suddenly over at Florida. It was time for the Gators to deal with life after Urban Meyer. They were in an unideal situation. As one could imagine, the 2011 coaching search was a doozy. The Gators thought they could lure former offensive coordinator Dan Mullen from his new post at Mississippi State. He was just a couple of years into his time there, and it really felt like they could get him. But a lot of the fans disliked Mullen's lack of head coach experience. So some big names got thrown out there, including Boise State's Chris Peterson, Oklahoma's Bob Stoops, Utah's Kyle Whittingham. Ultimately, they went out and hired Will Muschamp. This was very controversial. Muschamp had 0 head coaching experience. However, he was an excellent defensive coordinator. He coached at Texas and at Auburn and knew how to run things in the South. People were concerned, though, because of his lack of head coaching experience. The Will Muschamp era sputtered out of the gates. Florida went 7-6 in year 1, and the doubters got louder than ever. But they rebounded, 11-2, an SEC East title, and a Sugar Bowl appearance in the next season, which was their best season they had had since 2009. This turned out to be fool's gold, however, as Florida dropped to 4-8 in 2013, and despite much protest, Muschamp came back for the next season, posting a 6-5 start before being fired in the middle of his 4th season. So the Muschamp era quickly flamed out, and the Gators quickly moved on to Jim McElwain. He had several successful seasons at Colorado State. They hoped that a guy with more experience as a head coach could be a more steady hand at the wheel. However, the McElwain era rang eerily similar. After 19 wins in his first 2 seasons, riding the coattails of some excellent Will Muschamp recruiting classes, there was a 3-4 start in the 3rd season that got McElwain fired even faster than his predecessor. Say what you want about Will Muschamp, but he was able to at least maintain the Gators' recruiting level, turning in a top 10 class every season. McElwain benefited from those players initially, but barely cracked the top 10 in recruiting in his final season. Outside of that, he was recruiting down in the 20s, which is not what the Florida standard is. And so, after a couple disastrous hires, the Gators looked to go back to their roots and what worked during the Urban Meyer era. Florida found themselves in the unthinkable position of barely being able to field a competitive team, but elsewhere in the SEC, a head coach had stabilized a program into being in the national picture every year. That guy was Dan Mullen. Mullen was the offensive coordinator for Florida during both national titles and left 1 year prior to Meyer's resignation. Had he not left, he likely would have taken over the team back in 2011. Florida sought to correct this decision of hiring him as their guy in 2018, and soon things were humming. Florida's offense improved drastically from the McElwain and Muschamp era, and recruiting began to churn in the right direction. The Gators won a New Year's Six Bowl in each of his first 2 seasons, and it finally felt like things were getting back on track. In a tumultuous 2020 season, Florida was a strong team for most of the year, but lost 3 straight games to end the season after an 8-1 start, fell out of the playoff picture, and ended with an ugly blowout loss to Oklahoma. Florida was still a playoff contender, but they simply came out on the wrong end of some close games, including one in the SEC title game against Alabama. The following season was rocky. Florida was on the wrong end of 4 one-score games. Mullen fired his defensive coordinator, Todd Grantham, mid-season, who had been the guy that had been with him the whole time at Florida, but Florida still fired Mullen after a mid-November loss to Missouri. This firing was cited for a lack of elite defensive recruiting and obviously a disappointing 4th season, which brings us to the Billy Napier era. Napier had success at Louisiana and is headed into his 3rd season with the Gators. However, he's often found himself to be the butt of many jokes in the SEC. Under 500 in his first 2 seasons, he too is believed to be on the hot seat in year 3, which ties into my main point. What is wrong with Florida? What has gone wrong? Looking at all the facts, it boils down to a few key factors. Patience. Florida has not given a coach 4 full seasons to lead this program since Urban Meyer. That's not even a chance to get to see 1 full recruiting class through. With Will Muschamp, I get it. The cupboard was full and he wasn't getting it done. It was right off of the Urban Meyer era. Even Jim McElwain makes sense. Recruiting was alarmingly bad, and it wasn't going to magically be fixed in year 4. That's a big enough red flag to fire a guy. But the Dan Mullen firing is particularly puzzling. They had concerns with his defense, but fired him without ever seeing a full season with a new defensive mind. They ignored 3 seasons of goodwill, including 2 New Year's Six wins, for 1 poor season. With Napier, it doesn't seem they've learned their lesson. Florida plays a brutal schedule, and it seems as though they will fire him this season if he doesn't beat the already low expectations. The collapse of Florida football has been a case of a program growing too prideful in itself and too confident in the power of its own brand, to the point of ignoring what it takes to rebuild a program into one that can play at a championship level. If Florida's going to keep hiring and firing guys within 4 years until they find the next Nick Saban or Urban Meyer that can just win them a title in 2 seasons, they're going to be in the dumps for a long, long time.